For socialism, the basic principle is the well-being of the people, and the basic assumption is an acceptance of human equality. For socialism, there must be a belief that every individual man and woman, whatever color, shape, race, creed, religion, or sex, is an equal member of society, with equal rights in the society and equal duties to it. Hello, comrades. For this May Day video, I'm going to be talking about Julius Nyerere's Ujamaa essays on socialism. So Nyerere, for those of you who are not familiar with him, was the president of originally Tanganyika, but then in 1964 it changes to Tanzania. So he was the president of Tanzania from 1962 up until 85, I think. And Nyerere was one of the pioneering figures of what's sometimes called African socialism. This is a variation of socialism that blends traditional African socio-cultural organization, familial traditions, etc., with the principles of socialism more generally, in order to create a distinctly applicable system for post-colonial African nations. Nyerere is a big thinker in terms of African socialism, and Ujamaa is one of the sort of key theoretical texts that he creates. So what exactly does it mean to blend socialism with African socio-cultural traditions? Well, one of the key things that Nyerere continually stresses is that African socialism is built out of traditional organizations of society. So he says here, in the first essay in this collection, Ujamaa, the Basics of African Socialism, because the organization of traditional African society, its distribution of the wealth it produced, was such that there was hardly any room for parasitism. He's a little more specific about this. He says, there must be something wrong in a society where one man, however hardworking or clever he may be, can acquire as great a reward as 1,000 of his fellows can acquire between them. So the sort of initial premise here is that traditional African society was anti-exploitative, in a sense, that society was organized in order to provide mutual support amongst all of the members of society. And this idea of sort of reciprocal responsibility is really central to how Nyerere sees traditional African societies. He says here, for when a society is so organized that it cares about its individuals, then provided he is willing to work, no individual within that society should worry about what will happen to him tomorrow if he does not hoard wealth today. Society itself should look after him or his widow or his orphans. This is exactly what traditional African society succeeded in doing. Both the rich and the poor individual were completely secure in African society. Natural catastrophe brought famine, but it brought famine to everybody, poor or rich. Nobody starved, either of food or of human dignity, because he lacked personal wealth. He could depend on the wealth possessed by the community of which he was a member. So this is Nyerere's sort of central argument, is that within traditional African societies, there is a what Friedrich Engels called primitive socialism, almost, or primitive communism. The idea that within societies that depend to a certain extent on agrarian culture, on agrarian material culture, there is a much greater impetus to have a level of social equality, where everybody shares in the benefits of a successful harvest, for instance, or everybody suffers the consequences of an unsuccessful harvest. Not everybody necessarily gets an equal share in these traditional societies. We saw this as well in like European feudalism, right? This was not, despite what many people sort of popularly envision, a system wherein the wealthy were feasting while the peasants starved to death. Generally speaking, the peasants ate reasonably well as long as harvests were good, while nobles, aristocracy, knights, people like this lived better. But when harvests failed, like the start of the Little Ice Age in Europe, everybody suffered to greater or lesser extents. The same thing Nyerere says is happening here. He doesn't make that comparison. That's my comparison. But he basically says, yeah, everybody contributed to supporting society, and therefore everybody had their needs met within society, which, of course, if you know even the most basic things about Marxism, you will be familiar with that phrase, from each according to their abilities, to each according to their needs. And Nyerere basically says, yeah, in Africa, we've been doing this for, who knows, thousands of years. He sort of comes back to this point over and over and over throughout this first essay. He says here, for instance, in our traditional African society, we were individuals within a community. We took care of the community, and the community took care of us. So this is, again, this idea of sort of reciprocity, mutual reciprocity, that everyone within the society does not function as an atomized individual, the way that capitalist societies encourage us to see ourselves, but instead everybody functions within a network. And when that network succeeds, then the individuals succeed. This is also very similar to a lot of indigenous ethics, sometimes indigenous socialism, but often just indigenous ethics in general, capitalizing on or coming out of, say, North American indigenous cultures, Australian indigenous cultures, Maori, Polynesians, etc., etc. There is a lot of similarity here in the sense that societies that are dependent on sort of agricultural production, and often that are at the whims of particularly difficult environmental conditions, are more likely to develop somewhat egalitarian social structures. So the other thing that Nyerere says is that this foundation is based on the traditional structure of the African family. And he says directly, the foundation and the objective of African socialism is the extended family. The true African socialist does not look on one class of men as his brethren and another as his natural enemies. He does not form an alliance with the brethren for the extermination of the non-brethren. He rather regards all men as his brethren, as members of his ever-extending family. So this is actually the reason, part of the reason why Ujamaa becomes the sort of defining concept in Nyerere's version of African socialism, because Ujamaa in Swahili means something like kinship or family. So Nyerere is building on that idea. Because again, this is one of those things where the family structure becomes metaphorical for larger notions of reciprocity and mutual responsibility. And Nyerere, so one of the things that I think is important to sort of pause here and clarify about Nyerere's conception of traditional African society is that he has in mind a very specific conception of traditional African society. And that's the traditional African society of Tanzania, of really southern Africa, sort of. I think Tanzania is primarily sort of grassland area. I'm not 100% sure what the geographic extent of Tanzania is, but I think it's somewhat. I think of it as somewhat environmentally like the northern part of South Africa. That may be wrong. If I have no idea what Tanzania is like, please let me know in the comments. But this particular conception of the African family and African traditions is very much rooted in Nyerere's own Tanzania. Africa is a very diverse continent. There are hundreds, if not thousands, of different cultures in Africa. There are tons and tons and tons and tons of different ways of organizing society, organizing family life, organizing production, organizing gender relations, etc., etc. So Nyerere, and part of the thing that I think is worth remembering about this is Nyerere is writing. I think this comes out in 1968. So Nyerere is writing very much in the early sort of phases of the post-colonial period. This is an era in which the Black Power movement is very much starting to gain speed in the U.S., and there is some push for Pan-Africanism in Africa, especially. There is a significant, from today's perspective, there is a significant degree of cultural erasure when Nyerere says this is African tradition, because it is not the tradition in a lot of parts of Africa, in a lot of African cultures, ethnic groups, regions, etc., etc. But it is at least a dominant means of sociocultural Sorry, I have a mild cold at the moment. But it is at least a dominant means of sociocultural organization in Nyerere's Tanzania. So he uses what he knows as the basis for constructing an idea of African socialism. And it's not a bad idea, but it's also not an accurate representation of all African traditions, all African culture, all African family life, all African means of production, etc., etc. Massive, massive differences between different cultures in some cases. So that's worth noting. But the other thing I want to talk about in terms of Ujamaa Essays on Socialism is the role of education that Nyerere envisions. Because for me, this is very important. I'm an educator. I work in higher education. It's an issue close to my heart. But one of the things that Nyerere actually talks extensively about is education under African socialism. And this is so important that even the foundational idea of why it matters how the education system is set up is the first thing that we get there's the preface, but in the first essay, the first thing that we get actually points us to the importance of education. Because Nyerere says, socialism, like democracy, is an attitude of mind. In a socialist society, it is the socialist attitude of mind and not the rigid adherence to a standard political pattern, which is needed to ensure that the people care for each other's welfare. So, he doesn't directly mention education there, but what he does do is he sets up the importance of a worldview, a socialist worldview. And the way that one of the ways that socialists create a socialist worldview is by utilizing the education system. And he's partially really aware of how this works because of the way that the colonial education system worked in Africa. And people like Ngugi wa Thiong'o have made similar arguments about this. But what Nyerere says here is, this is later in the book, in the essay Education for Self-Reliance. He says, the education provided by the colonial government was not designed to prepare young people for the service of their country. Instead, it was motivated by a desire to inculcate the values of the colonial society and to train individuals for the service of the colonial state. This is a big critique of colonial education systems, going into neo-colonial education systems, in fact. So also in The Wretched of the Earth, Frantz Fanon makes this point about colonial education systems training people, in this case, in African colonial systems, but in India, in the Caribbean, in South Asia, in Latin America, wherever it is. Colonial education systems were designed to train people for submission to colonial authorities and to be of service to colonial authorities as minor officials, as clerks, as cogs within the machines of colonial authority, whatever it was. And so Nyerere is very aware here. He's very cognizant of the role that colonial education played in constructing a specific worldview, and in the effectiveness of that. He's very aware of the effectiveness of that as well. So he says here, inevitably too, it was based, and this is, again, the it here is the colonial education system. It was based on the assumptions of a colonialist and capitalist society. It emphasized and encouraged the individualistic instincts of mankind instead of his cooperative instincts. It led to the possession of individual material wealth being the major criterion of social merit and worth. This meant that colonial education induced attitudes of human inequality and in practice underpinned the domination of the weak by the strong, especially in the economic field. So in other words, because the colonial education system taught people to think and view the world as capitalists within a colonialist system, it built systems of inequality by encouraging people to see those as the norm. In contrast, what Nyerere wants is a socialist, an African socialist education system in which the objective of education, the type of society that students are encouraged to view as positive and desirable, is very different. What he says here is, this is what our education system has to encourage. It has to foster the social goals of living together and working together for the common good. It has to prepare our young people to play a dynamic and constructive part in the development of a society in which all members share fairly in the good or bad fortune of the group, and in which progress is measured in terms of human well-being, not prestige buildings, cars, or other such things, whether privately or publicly owned. Our education must therefore inculcate a sense of commitment to the total community. And then a little bit later, he says, the education provided must therefore encourage the development in each citizen of three things: an inquiring mind, an ability to learn from what others do and reject or adapt it to his needs. Sorry, that's part of two. And a basic confidence in his own position as a free and equal member of the society who values others and is valued by them for what he does and not for what he obtains. So basically, the idea is that we know already from the colonial education system that it can be used to create a specific worldview in young people, a worldview contrary to the natural impulses of the society from which they come. That is a communal society in which reciprocity and mutual responsibility are the norm. We know that people can be taught, trained, educated, maybe, by the education system to see themselves as individuals striving for wealth and to measure their relative social success based on their accumulation of wealth. So instead, what we should do is use our education system to train students to align their values, their worldviews with the natural impulses of this society, in which, again, communal support, mutual reciprocity, mutual respect, and responsibility are all central. But we should also be training students to think critically and creatively and to assess what's going on in the world. I think it's generally actually quite an admirable argument about education. The one critique I do really have about Nyerere's conception of education is that he does argue that sort of unnecessary elements of education should largely be abandoned. And I get this from a socialist perspective. There is a critique of sort of abstract education, the traditional liberal arts education, maybe, as being a sort of bourgeois extravagance, bourgeois decadence, things like this. As somebody in the humanities, I tend to really strongly disagree with that. I think there are significant upsides to a broad foundation of education and to an education in the arts and humanities as such, even if it doesn't immediately have sort of practical, economic, productive value, it has other types of value. And I don't know that Nyerere would necessarily sort of disagree with that, but he is in a place in 1968 where Tanzania is again just emerging from the colonial period. They are attempting, people throughout post-colonial nations are attempting to define where their countries are going to go. And he has a very particular vision. And I think he might argue in 1968 that education should have a utility rather than, at this point in Tanzania's development, we don't have the sort of luxury of treating education as an abstract conception. It needs to be more practical and foundational. I think that's what he would argue. I don't know if his position necessarily evolves that much over time, but based on the other elements of Nyerere's conception of socialism, I think he probably would be supportive of a more broad education system, provided it is still in the service of African socialism.